going to get going then. So, yeah, all about If Only. And whilst it is about a rebreather fatality from just over 2 years ago, it's applicable to all of the diving that everybody does. Open circuit, beginner diving, technical diving, military diving, scientific diving, because it's about the human factors that are involved in this. And as I'll explain as we go through this isn't just about factors of the human. It is much more complicated than that. And there's lots of factors and contributing causes and causal factors that come into this, that on the surface, this looks like quite a simple accident to look at. But I'm going to go through a little bit of theory in terms of human factors and non-technical skills, what they are, why they're important, and then go through the documentary, a number of the issues that were brought up, and then open it up to questions. So I'm looking at about sort of 55 minutes, and then as many questions as you want to ask, basically. So start off with my background, why do I do this stuff, and the sort of competencies to talk about it. I spent 25.5 years in the Royal Air Force. I left in February 2015, having spent a lot of time flying in Hercules transport aircraft as a multi-crew environment. I was a flight commander on a squadron. I was a flight instructor. I then worked in sort of systems engineering, requirements management, and started to understand how stuff comes together in a systems view. But it's quite easy to look at things in silos, little containers, and say it's one of those, as opposed to how a system interacts. In terms of diving experience, about 800 dives, GUE Tech 2, so advanced trimix level, and TDI JJ Mod 1, so initial air diluent or heliotrox diluent gas for a JJ. I've worked in multiple high-risk environments. Obviously, aviation's one of them, where I was an operator and also an instructor and a supervisor. But I've taught in healthcare, in the oil and gas sector, construction, power utilities, high-risk industries, where actually failure can be literally the life or death situation. I've got a strong interest in high-performance team development, understanding how does a team come together, how do they interact, how do they communicate, how do they make decisions as a team, and importantly, how do they deal with failure as a team? And this is this concept of just culture, which I'll explore a little bit more as we go through the presentation. Now, in 2018, I'd had a number of people saying, well, why don't you write a book? You've got lots of stuff here. You can use it in the classes you teach. So in March 18, I started putting together Under Pressure, the book that basically consolidates all of the teachings that I deliver, and my knowledge has moved on from there. But at that time, it was consolidating everything that's there. And what I wanted to do was make it a theory and practical based book, because people love stories, and it's much easier to relate to a story than just have a whole bunch of theory. So I wrote to about 60 people, and I got more than 40 responses back. And those were pretty comprehensive stories. I'd said, look, I'm looking for somewhere around about 1,000 words per person to come together with a story. And I will take that story and I'll look at it from a human factors lens, or a just culture lens, or a systems thinking lens, to say, how did that event occur, and how can you learn, not from just identifying the issues, but also from the lessons that are learned within it, and then saying, these are the things that you need to change, because there is a difference between the lessons identified and the lessons learned. The difference being, if you learn it, you have to have changed something, or you accept the risk or the problems that are associated with that activity. So that was the sort of book that was released in March 19, and that was my sort of major focus at that time, or through sort of end of 18, start of 19. Now in May 2018, on a number of the forums, there was a tragic accident talked about by the widow, Ashley Buggy, talking about her husband getting off a dive boat and going hypoxic on the surface. So he had an insufficient amount of oxygen in his rebreather loop to keep him alive. And he passed out unconscious and sank to about 35, 40 meters. Now Ashley posted the rebreather manufacturer's report, which talked about the factors involved. And it was just like, oh, I'd love to be able to tell this story through the lens of human factors and just culture, so it become a learning experience. And the reason for doing this is because about 10 years ago, there was a film produced called Just a Routine Operation. And anybody who's involved in healthcare will have probably come across this, in which an ex-airline pilot, in fact, he still is an airline pilot, produced this documentary about his wife dying in a hospital from a routine operation. And what I was looking for was not to be the sort of the ambulance chaser that was there, but to look for the opportunity where somebody is willing to tell the story about what happened. And so when I saw this story from Ashley, I waited a bit, and then I wrote to her and said, look, Ashley, this is who I am. This is what I've done. This is just a routine operation. I'd like to tell Brian's story and the dive team story and your story in the same way that Martin Bromley had produced Just a Routine Operation. And she said, look, it's a bit tender at the moment, a bit raw. Come back later. So last year, sorry, in May last year, I contacted her again and said, look, this is, I'm still here. What are your thoughts? And she said, yes, let's make this happen. And that happened. We went out to Hawaii in November last year, and we filmed the dive team talking about the stuff that had happened. We filmed Ashley talking about stuff. And I'll cover a little bit more about the documentary in a minute. But the goal was really to tell this story, as I say, through the lens, see where my mouse has got to, through a lens of human factors and a just culture. Now, what is human factors? It's a huge topic. It's a science of its own, in which they look at the interactions of people and other people and systems that they're dealing with. And that could be hardware, it could be paperwork, it could be social systems, it could be the legal systems. And this is a sort of an onion type diagram. So we look at the centerpiece, and it's like, what do we do? And how do we interact with hardware, physical ergonomics, so controls, displays, user interface, the size of our body. And then we go, let's look at our behaviors within the system, and then the group behaviors, and then management, organization, legal, and then societal bits. What I spend a lot of my time dealing with is a subset of that called crew resource management or non-technical skills. And this is where people think human factors is about, or actually they often think it's factors of the human. So what I'm going to do is just give you a brief overview and say it's not that. It's far more complicated. It's a much bigger piece. Now, what we could say is it's really simple, in a simple phrase, is making it easy to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing. And by that, I use the example of Homer. He works in a nuclear power station. He has got a panel with loads of buttons, dials that he's got to deal with. He's not particularly well trained, but he thinks he's okay because he hasn't had any accidents. So he's trying to deal with this. At the same time, he's got his own physiology to deal with. Hunger, thirst, donuts, cool. That gives me the energy. Coffee, that gives me energy too. Now, the problem with coffee and donuts is you end up with a sugar and a caffeine rush and a crash. But that's okay because Homer takes a donut every hour and he drinks a coffee every hour. So it's all cool. So, but he's also got to deal with the organizational aspects, and he's got Mr. Burns, the plant operator, sitting there on his shoulder going, keep the plant going, keep the plant going. So he's got to deal with these pressures. And then one day, 5 minutes to the hour, it's after lunch as well, so he's got a bigger crash anyway, the sugar crash. If you're ever involved in teaching, the bit after lunch is the graveyard shift, because everybody's sitting there going, oh. So, you know, he's struggling at that stage anyway, but it's all right, because on the top of the hour, he's got another donut. 5 seconds to go, the lights start going, the horn goes blaring, and he really hasn't got a clue what's going on, because the controls are not very effective, his brain's not working properly, and he's got this memory of Mr. Burns going, keep it on, keep it going, or you're fired. So, you know, this is what human factors is about. Designing systems to make it easy to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing. And that's not just about hardware, as we'll give some examples, it's about how we interact. So these are examples from the healthcare environment. Machine on the left-hand side, the same button or display that turns the machine on and off is almost the same as another button to turn the suction on and off. So you could be halfway through an activity, distracted, and turn the machine off. On the right-hand side, we've got medication, we've got heparin, and the top image is what the bottles used to look like. And unfortunately, when Dennis Quaid's twin daughters were nearly killed because they injected heparin, which is a blood thinning agent, instead of a flushing solution into their blood system, they had a problem. Those bottles look almost identical, and when you're rushed, you're going to pick up the wrong one. So actually, the manufacturer, Baxter, changed the heparin bottle, the really strong chemical, into red and black, and then says, do not use for flush. So it's about making it hard to do, you know, the wrong thing here. Now, the bit in the middle is a door release and an emergency door release that's associated with an alarm. And the two post-it notes, one says door release, happy smiley face, and the one underneath says annoying noise. And you'd sit there and go, why would somebody put a normal release and an alert and an alarm right next to each other? And then you say, there's only one set of cabling running down from the ceiling. So if I just join this one into the one above, great, I don't have to do lots of other things. I don't have to put other stuff. So we're efficient as much as we can be. So Angela, can you mute your microphone, please? So I've got that through. So it's not about just about the physical stuff. It's about also the subset where we talk about non-technical skills or crew resource management. And this is about communications, teamwork, leadership, situational awareness, decision-making. They're all this sort of group that's called non-technical skills. And the goal, create a shared mental model of the team or within the team. And that includes people like the skipper or the dive manager, or when it comes to an emergency, the emergency medical services. So non-technical skills is not the same as human factors, and human factors is not just factors of the human, which is what a lot of people think. It's about decision-making and just being human. It's like, well, there's more than that. So when we look at how things occur in the sort of the real world, what we're looking at is outcomes. And we often think that outcomes are a function of technical skills. So in the context here of diving, line laying, using a DPV, using a rebreather, buoyancy control, trim, propulsion, using a video camera or a camera underwater. Those are all technical skills. And if you're good at those, then we're going to get good outcomes. But actually, it's a little bit more complex than that, as you'd expect, because we've got people and things start to be a little bit more difficult. So in this here, what we're looking at as well is the context. So what's the environment like? What's the culture like? What's the social situation like? The physical environment could be visibility, current, temperature, those sorts of things. Then we've got the task. How well is that designed? Can we do the right thing easily? And are we setting people up for success or failure? And the easy one that I pick here is a sort of an entry-level Discover Scuba Diver. You can take 4 divers underwater at the same time, as long as you've got direct control. So, well, hang on a minute, I have 2 hands and 4 divers. How do I have direct control? So you've got potentially a conflict straight away. Now, I know why the conflict is there, because it's about money, and that's a tension within the system. Then we look at randomness compared to luck. Now, about 25% of the population has got a PFO, a hole in the heart, which allows blood from the venous side to go to the arterial side without going through the lungs. Now, unless you've had a test, you don't know that you've got a PFO. I know I had one, I've had it fixed. So if it happens to me, that's potentially unlucky, but as a sample for the population, it's about 25%. So there is these factors that need to be taken into account. And then we end up with these non-technical skills as well, which is, as it says here, decision-making, situation awareness, communication, teamwork, and leadership and followership. Now, you might have noticed that there is an X, a multiplication symbol between these different factors or domains. And that's important because what we're saying here is, what's the threshold for success? Because if they were just additive, then it wouldn't make much of a difference. But if we start multiplying those factors up, so if I say actually your technical skills, they're about 0.8, that, you know, these are just arbitrary numbers, made up numbers. 0.8 for your technical skills, context, you know, nearly everything's in the right place, luck is on your side, and you've got, in terms of a score of your non-technical skills, you've just got a score of 0.8. Now that gives you an overall score of just under half. Now, the sort of threshold for success might be 0.4, 0.3, we don't know. Now, looking at the other side, if we've got technical skills the same, context is the same, luck is still on our side, but we miss some critical information because of miscommunication, and that miscommunication leads to a poor understanding of what the future looks like, we make a bum decision, and we actually end up with a score of 0.2, we end up with a really low score at that stage. Now, these are just made up numbers, but just to show you the fact that they are all relevant and we need to take all of them into account. Technical skills development, that's what we see when we're looking at in the underwater environment, is we look at rebreather, open circuit, using DPV, all of the emergency skills, including the stuff in the bottom left, which is rescue. Now, how often do people practice those rescue skills? The same thing for rebreather divers. How many times do you practice doing live bailouts from depth? Well, my experience is people do them between, they rarely do them between courses because it costs me money to replace the gas in my open circuit bailout cylinders. It's like, yeah, but you don't want to be poorly developed, you know, in skills wise. When something goes wrong, you've got to get it right. If we look at the context, these are a number of different context environments that we're talking about. And I'll look at two that are, well, it's linked to the same one, and in terms of cultural and psychological. Psychological safety is this ability to have, and it says here, a shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. By that, it means that it's okay to put my hand up and question somebody else in the team, the instructor, the skipper, that environment that says, I might be wrong, but they expect me to speak up because we're working together as a team rather than as individuals. The other bit, and so that's proactive, that helps us prevent accidents occurring because we can highlight issues beforehand. The other side of it is a just culture, in which we are going to be looking at the errors that have been made, the violations that have happened, and looking at them in a constructive, positive way so that we can change our behaviors in the future. And that is why, you know, they both link together in terms of learning. One is proactive and one is reactive. Now, if you look at this situation, this was published a couple of, about a week and a bit ago. Aviation minister says pilots were overconfident and not focused on their job. That is not a great way to look at the accident that happened, and it killed 97 people of the 99 on board. And if the Pakistani investigation board, in fact, the French Airbus people have just released preliminary reports of this as well, as to understanding what was going on, looking at the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder information as to, in effect, how it made sense for the pilots to make an approach late, fast. They cleaned up the aircraft because they were going too fast, but they still carried on their approach, not quite sure why. They hit the runway, they ran down the runway and damaged both engines. Then they put the power on and went to do another circuit. And as they started to make the approach for the second time, they lost control and say 97 of the 99 killed. It must have made sense for those two pilots to do what they're doing. So blaming them for sort of incompetence and lacking focus does not help the situation. And there's a bunch of research papers that talk about when you have a stressful environment, you don't have psychological safety, you will end up with more accidents and fewer successes. When we talk about randomness and luck, we are dealing with biases here. When things don't go wrong, we think it's okay. And we are dealing mainly with uncertainty rather than risk. We don't know the numbers associated with going diving and the genuine, so I'll go on to this bit here, the genuine bit about risk. What is the probability, a number, of something going wrong on a dive in terms of out of gas or a separation or a decompression incident? We go back to this bit that says we can tell you at a population level that potentially one in 150 to 1 in 300,000 dives for UK data ends up in a fatality. Well, that number, call it average, because the number that's talked about often is 1 in 200,000. 1 in 200,000 dives may as well be infinity as far as I'm concerned, because I'm never going to do 200,000 dives. So if you use something like a risk matrix like this to manage risk, and I don't think many people do in diving, but they might do in their business, just think about what's the likelihood, what's the probability. We know roughly what the severity could be, but it's still on a spectrum, anything from a minor injury to death. So we have a huge stuff that we're trying to do. A better way of thinking about it is how confident are we that the controls we've got in place are actually effective? And are they just there for paper safety? And I raised this at a DEMA 3 or 4 years ago and asked, when you're managing safety, because the comment was, as long as your paperwork is correct, you'll be safe. And I asked the question, do you mean operationally safe or safe from litigation? Because those are two slightly different things. Think about how you put those controls in place, and when was the last time you tested them? When was the last time you tried to cut somebody out of a harness to make sure that you could do it? So think about those. And these hierarchy of controls that we're talking about eliminate the hazard as best we can. So think about it differently. Substitution, can we do one task compared to another to achieve the same goal? Can we design out the problem and help us with that? And so rebreathers have evolved considerably in terms of engineering controls. Administrative controls is training, paperwork, and make sure that people fill in the paperwork and it's all okay. And then finally, we've got PPE, personal protection equipment, and that's not really applicable so much with diving, but so we're talking about those other levels. Consider, actually, there's a whole, if you're involved in designing this stuff, there's a whole raft of evidence out there and information about how to design it with human factors principles in mind. And then we'll talk about the non-technical skills in more detail. And what I'm going to do now is touch on a couple of those because they are quite fundamental as to how we get to where we are. And they're also a bit more interesting than some of the communications and teamwork and leadership and followership stuff. So thinking, decisions. We have two systems that operate in us. And there's a guy called Kahneman, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for behavioral economics because of the work that they were doing in this sense. And we have system one, which operates in about 95, 99% of our life. We are operating in automatic behaviors where we're thinking quickly. And the book that Kahneman wrote is called Thinking Fast and Slow. So we like to be efficient. We like to not pay attention to stuff and take mental shortcuts, which are what these heuristics are. What we don't like is applying slow thought, being methodical, logical, because we like to get stuff done. And in fact, the world couldn't operate at the pace it does if we didn't operate in system one. But we do need system two, where we have to slow ourselves down. So one of the problems here is that actually there isn't a binary bit. Although Kahneman said there's system one and system two, what we have is a whole spectrum. And the brilliant thing about, and the confusing thing about human performance behaviors is the interdependence and how all of these things sync together. We can simplify it and say thinking fast, thinking slow, but in the real world, it's a little bit more difficult or different to that. And the reason is that we have mental models, mental pictures about what the future is going to look like. And we have this little prediction engine inside our head that says, I'm just going to look at a scene and I'll say, I know that. So if I look out the window, the sky is dark here. It's like, well, it might rain. And that is just, I will look out and I don't necessarily consciously think about that. It happens automatically. And so we build up that experience over time, and that allows us to be complacent and using assumptions. Now, I love it when people talk about assumptions. Oh, they made an assumption. It's like, you make assumptions all the time. And so we trade off this bit between complacency and efficiency. When things go well and we've done the same activity, we call it efficiency. But when we do almost the same thing in terms of the assumptions that are being made and it goes wrong, we call it complacency. So we're judging things based on outcomes rather than the process we got to get there. And so this guy here, Christian Sylvester, talked about, this double-edged sword of complacency, stroke attention pay, the amount of attention we pay. When we are in the new area A, when we're learning, we're in this bit that actually says we are potentially consciously incompetent. I genuinely don't know what I don't know, and I'm trying to learn how to do that. And that takes lots of time. If you think about going back to your first open water dives, or if you're rebreather certified, being the first few dives there, the amount of attention paid just to operate the dive equipment or to breathe in and out underwater, that's a lot of attention. And that means that we don't have any other capacity to see what else is going on. But over a period of time, of weeks, months, potentially years, we get better skilled at something. And so we now get to more automatic behaviors. We make assumptions about stuff all the time. And that means that we don't necessarily pay attention to the scene, the activity around us. What we do have, though, are more capacity to see the other bits that are around us. So we've got this double-edged sword. One is we get more experience and we don't necessarily pay attention to the task, but that also gives us the capacity to see what else is going on and what might go wrong and look for those cues and clues. The biases we have are essential. We couldn't operate in the real world we did. And that is how we interact with an instructor, how we believe our dive equipment is going to behave. So it might be you dive a twin set and you don't necessarily, you should check the isolator on the twin set, but there are times where you might look down and go, oh, okay, the gas hasn't gone down much. That's a bit interesting. Okay. And we don't necessarily think that it might be because the manifold is shut. We think, oh, cool, gas consumption's improved from the last time I went diving. And then it happens again. You think, oh, okay. And then something goes, it isn't quite right. What's happening? Oh, I'll just do a flow check. Okay, we're thumbing the dive because now I have no idea what is in those cylinders because the gas will now mix. So we've got these biases, they're essential, and there's a blog that I put together. Now people go, well, this is all about intuition. So I can use my intuition to make that shortcut and I can decide that that's the best thing to do. And this is a picture of Kahneman in an interview. And he said, intuition only works if these three things are in place. It's regularity. So there is repeatability. It's consistent. So if I do this, then that happens. And I can build up a consistent mental model. We undertake lots of practice. So when we are interacting with a system, if I do this, so chess players, are very good at using intuition, grandmasters are, because they have practiced lots and lots and lots, and they get immediate feedback at the third part of this as to whether or not that move will work or not. In diving, unless you dive lots, this intuition won't work. And the problem is that people go, oh yeah, I remember seeing this. It's the right thing to do. And what happens is if we don't have that consistency and we don't have that practice, we don't have that feedback, we just make stuff up. And to show that, I'm going to show you 3 little video clips. And I want you to think about what's happening.
An event seen from one point of view gives one impression.
So immediately you will have had a mental model about what is happening now.
Seen from another point of view, it gives quite a different impression.
So we've only got, sort of 5-second clips, but you're building a mental picture about what's going on. So potentially you've got somebody running from a car because there's a problem, and they're running towards the guy with a briefcase and looking to potentially steal the briefcase off him. However,
but it's only when you get the whole picture you can fully understand what's going on.
This happens all the time in life. We make those mental shortcuts. Now, things that limit our learning from those biases, hindsight bias. We can tell the story about what happened in the past because we know what the outcome is, and we can start joining the dots. Those involved cannot see what the future looks like with 100% accuracy. You can, because you know what the outcome is, and you can identify the critical factors. The more severe an outcome, the harsher we judge something. So if somebody almost has an accident, like they almost run out of gas, it's not so much of an issue. But if they run out of gas and drown, and it's only a little bit different, then we judge things much more harshly. And the other bit is a fundamental attribution bias. We judge people based on their individual, we look at individual attributions rather than the context. And that's really what the film was about. And I'm conscious that we're going to go through these bits because I want to get onto the film actually. So in fact, that's important. So what we have in the real life, this concept called seeing the invisible from a guy called Gareth Lock, in which he looked at the difference between novices and experts and people called journeymen, those who are on a journey to improvement. And he started with firemen and fire chiefs and said, oh, how do you make that decision? So I didn't make a decision, I just did stuff. And it was this intuition that he was trying to explore. And over a period of time, he recognized that they would build a mental model, which was on the outside. They would say, okay, I've encountered a situation that would generate some cues. So it might be in the context of diving that I can see that the seaweed is now lying on its side. And you sit there going, okay, that's a bit different. And it matches a pattern that says the current has changed and it's now moving in that direction. And it is stronger than I remember it, so I need to do something about it. So that's the action script. And then I do something that generates some cues, and I might go into the lee of the wreck or a reef, and then that basically generates some patterns. So we're really good at that pattern matching. Now, what he recognized was that if you were an expert, you could run a mental model. You could run a simulation in your head subconsciously that says, I've seen this before, this is what's going to happen, and I need to do X, Y, and Z to solve the problem. The greater the experience and the knowledge you have, the more mental models and the fidelity that's in there that allows you to run more accurate decision-making processes. And this is why experience is so important, because it allows you to create knowledge about what's going on, and why debriefs are so important as well. Now, where I got to with this is it's a model about situation awareness of how we perceive information, we process it to make sense of it, and how we look to the future. Novices, journeymen can do level 1, level 2 relatively easily. Level 3 is where experts sit. They have encountered a situation and they know what the future looks like. based on experience and based on how easy it is to use this system. But importantly, when it comes to decision making, garbage in, garbage out, because the first part about decision making, gather the information and then execute on what's going on. So situational awareness is we only see those things we're expecting to see. And in this image here, these three images are gorillas, literally gorillas. So if you come across something called theinvisiblegorilla.com, they took this as a research paper and said, let's look at radiologists and see whether or not there are cancerous tumors in these lung x-rays. And what they found out was that so there was 2/3 of the radiologists missed the gorilla that's shown on the scene, even though their eyes were looking at exactly the point that was in the scene, because they were using eye tracking software to see where things were. And you sit there going, how can you not see it? Because it's that ability to focus on what's important or relevant, and be aware of the fact that we can't pay attention to everything all the time, because our brains filter stuff. And what they filter is something called, well, these limitations: dangerous, important, pleasurable, or interesting. If it's one of those four, it'll grab our attention. If it's not, it'll ditch it and it'll move on. And the problem is we only know after the event whether or not something was dangerous, important, or interesting. Now, the pleasurable bit might be because somebody says, did you see the shark behind you? No. What? So, you know, there is these bits. So if we see something, then actually it draws our attention. But that comes from experience as well. We've got to look for things that are going to catch us out. So TEM is threat and error management. Look for the threats that are out there. And that might be the current changing. It might be increased gas consumption. It might be visibility. It might be your diver who's starting to have flappy arms because they're going to start developing panic fairly soon. Build habits. Use your complacency to your advantage, because now we can do things on autopilot. But be aware that being on autopilot isn't necessarily a good thing. And decision support tools are about debriefs. Now, I'm not going to do that. What I am going to do now is go on to If Only and the film. And what I want to do is set the scene, talk about the timeline of what we did, but also the timeline of the events itself. So I touched on the background a little bit already. So, and the timeline to getting to Hawaii to produce the documentary. It took us 4 days of filming. The Saturday we sat down, and that was the first time that the dive team had got together since the accident. And suffice to say, it was a very emotional day. But we got Ashley, the 3 members of the dive team, and a couple of other people that were involved there to talk about what had happened, because there is nothing like hearing the story from each of the individual people. And what was interesting was, with any event like this, as you start telling stories, you hear different things. And that's not just because it's 18 months since the accident happened, but it's also because people remember different things. And each time we tell a story, we tell it and then we re-encode it. So our memories are not like video recorders. We don't just record it and it stays the same. So this bit about eyewitness accounts changing over time, not unsurprising. So we then got back in November, and then I spent the next, well, month or so, 6 weeks, taking 6 hours worth of video and putting it into a 34-minute chunk, or about 32 minutes in the end, and slicing it up and giving it to JP Bresser, who's the videographer from the Netherlands, and said, JP, make that work. And he's like, what? The bits, and anybody who's been involved in editing will know that it's a huge challenge to get stuff that doesn't appear to be in line. So as I was going through that, what I wanted to do was bring out some of the lessons identified, which were the captions in the film, to bring it to life. So, you know, those people who've open water diving, or in fact have never done Discover Scuba Diver, so they don't know that they shouldn't be left on their own at the bottom. As open water divers, you shouldn't be going into an overhead, like a cavern environment. So putting captions like that, highlighting things like psychological safety, the inability of people to speak up. So when Barbara was sitting there getting ready, going, you know what, this is wrong. I need to say something. I need to challenge the instructor, but I can't because culturally, I'm a professional. I'm in this. I've got a service background, and it would look wrong for me to challenge. And so it's highlighting to instructors that they create the learning environment for others to speak up. And as I was going through that, and if you've downloaded or gone to the page, humandiver.com/if only, there is a guide there, a field guide, which lists the 53 contributory factors that I picked out of just the 20 minutes worth of narrative that Ashley and the dive team were talking about. And they're looking at different layers within the system. And a number of you may have come across this before, the Swiss cheese model. And so I, in the workbook, the field guide, have identified those at the organizational level, those at the supervisory level, what Brian and the dive team did to set themselves up for failure or success, and then the active failures, the unsafe acts. And it's only when all of those align that we end up with a bad accident. And if you think about the scoring, when we talked about the different things for outcomes, it could be that that was at 0.2, 0.4, 0.8, whatever. It requires a certain threshold to be crossed before we end up with an accident. So what I'd like to, in fact, is now go back to here. What I'd like to do now is open up to questions. In fact, we'll do that. It doesn't matter, these sort of slides. The questions to the floor as stuff that you might have had from watching the film and reading the book. And I'm going to see if I can stop share and go back to here, and then I'll bring the presentation back up. So I'm open for discussions. I know we've got 61 other people online apart from me, so it might be worth either typing "I've got a question" in the chat window, and then Karen can unmute you. It's probably the easiest way to do it. And I've stopped early so we can have these discussions.
Sorry, I haven't been looking at the messages. I've been listening, so let's have a look here.
There's no messages as yet.
There's a couple there.
Oh, sorry, what I meant is there's no questions. There's some messages, but no questions.
Ah, yes, okay. Guys, anything? Nobody?
So what actually, here's one. If nobody's going to put a question there, is what was your biggest takeaway from the documentary? What made the biggest thing?
The saying over there, seeing the invisible, that really touched home for me. It's just about the experience that people are gathering, and you can't get away from experience. It just makes you so much better. The more you do it, the better you get at it.
Yeah, and so the invisible bit, what Klein had picked up was the fact that novices and journeymen would know what should be there. Experts could see what was missing from the scene. So his initial work was done with fire chiefs, and they'd arrive on the scene, and they would be able to look at the color of the smoke, the speed at which the smoke was rising. They would be able to imagine what other stuff was happening. And the sort of novices, the journeyman, go, how do you know that? So, well, because it's obvious, it's this, and this. It's like, no, I haven't been taught that. And I think that's where, and what Klein found was how they built that knowledge up was the power of the debrief. They would clean their fire gear up, they'd set the engine up ready for the next shout, and then they'd go upstairs, grab a coffee, grab a tea, and they'd sit and they'd talk about what they saw, what they heard, what they felt emotionally and physically, what they smelt, all of these cues, because people in a team will see different things. And it's about creating a much more accurate shared mental model within that team to allow you to fight the fire in that case better. Or it could be about exploring a wreck or a cave system, or just looking for wildlife, squidge. You know, my first time trying to find scallops, which you can do in the UK, you can catch those by hand. I found very few. I came up and I went, how do you get all of those scallops? And I got none. He went, what were you looking for? I went, I'm looking for a shell lying on the sand. And he went, nah. What you're looking for is the ridge in the sand where they're filter feeding, and they've created the little groove in the sand, you're not going to see the scallop, but you will see the little groove, and you're like, aha. So it's that bit that I couldn't see the scallop, but you don't need to see the scallop. You need to look for something else. So questions coming in. Hein, it was mentioned the original instructor walked out due to the divers not having enough hours. Background to this. Yeah. So what was the course they were in was a sort of a novel course. It was almost put together based on existing agency training standards, course module. The courses were then put together in this sort of academy, and the instructor that was supposed to teach at the weekend, they got everybody together on the Tuesday, they went through the plans, and the instructor said, okay, so what hours have you got on your unit, because there is the minimum required for the class on Saturday/Sunday. And went through, and Brian went, well, I've got this. And it's like, well, that's not enough as the entry requirement for the air. It was basically an advanced recreational trimix class on their rebreather. So they were already Mod 1 certified, so they used an air diluent, and this was just in effect a top-up class. But it needed a certain number of hours on the unit before you could start the class. And the instructor said, you haven't got enough hours. They said, well, we're going ahead. And he said, look, I'm not happy teaching this class, so I'm going to walk out, which really upset everybody because they've been waiting ages to try and get this class together. And the owner of the dive center went, I'll teach it. And that was the instructor on the day. So would it have made a big difference in terms of having another 3 or 4 hours? I don't know, probably not, because 2 weeks before, Brian had made the same error in terms of the computer had switched itself off and he hadn't started it back up before he got off on the back of the boat. In this case, the oxygen was turned on, but so he didn't go hypoxic, and the system failed safely and kicked in dive mode rather than surface mode. So hopefully, Hein, that answered the question. Next one from Anand. How do we overcome the relaxedness in thinking when we're going on a recreational dive, which presents an opposing mental state? Also the emotional aspect of being excited, especially for novel divers. So the easiest way to do this, and it's really hard for the instructors because there's a certain amount of ego, there's a certain amount of professionalism that's involved and expected, is for the instructor to set the scene that says, you know what, I'm fallible too. I make mistakes. So the way that I manage the mistakes that I do, you know, I'm going to make, I want you to help me. You know, the number of instructors who don't do genuine buddy checks with their students, and the students look on and go, oh, the instructor's not doing a check. So when you get to be that good, you don't need to do pre-dive checks. It's about creating a culture of accountability. I am fallible, and if you see something, I expect you to challenge me. In the same way that if I see something that you're not doing right, I will challenge you. Now, one of the challenges we have in recreational diving is what is right and what is wrong. We end up having, you know, there are very few black and white situations in diving. There's a lot of gray. So when I look at you and you're putting your kit together or you're doing a pre-dive check, are you missing something out because it's different, or are you missing something out because you've forgotten it? And, you know, I know that GUE gets a fair amount of grief for the standardization. And actually standardization like this is a huge benefit, because I can look at my buddy's dive gear and go, yep, that's all there, or that's wrong, because it's different and we spot differences quickly. Or if somebody's not doing a drill properly, I know what it is, so I can call them out. So that is, and going to the bit about being excited, especially for novice divers, it is great. You know, they want to get underwater, and it's about that tension that says, this is a fun activity, but do not be under any, you know, sort of impression that if you run out of gas at depth, you're not in a good place to be. So there is a phrase called a healthy unease or a chronic unease. Recognize that we've got to do things right and we will drift. So I'm going to hold you to account, and I want you to hold me to account. So hopefully that answered that. And do you think Paddy, Nowie, etc. should bring CRM into all their training courses as a norm, as we do in the aviation industry? Yes. That's the simple bit. At the same time, I also know there are huge barriers to putting that in place, because as a sweeping generalization, safety in diving is measured by the number of dead people and the number of serious injuries. Fortunately, there aren't very many of those. So at an organizational level, you can sit there and say diving is statistically safe, randomness versus luck. To add value to this in the training programs would require a huge, and my ultimate goal is, yes, make it happen, but it would require a huge recognition that instructors are fallible, instructor trainers are fallible, divers are fallible, and that's not a good marketing thing, and I get that. But over time, you know, I've been doing this since January 16 now. I've trained 350 divers face-to-face. I've had about 1,500 people on the online class. I reckon I've sold about 3,500 copies of the book now. And being invited into activities like this, it is slowly changing bottom up because people are starting to learn. And I'm hoping that it will change top down. But the only reason that happened in aviation was because they were killing a lot of people by crashing aircraft and blaming it on pilot error. We don't have those same numbers. The same thing for healthcare. You know, medical error is a huge issue. That's a bucket that you can throw stuff in. It's a lot more complicated than that. But you know, that's why healthcare is starting to bring human factors and CRM into activities. But anything I can do to influence agencies, I'd love to. Jerome, did you manage to have the dive school view on the incident? Dive Perspectives shows a lot of peer pressure, money pressure leading to the accident. So we, not the instructor itself, because there were a whole bunch of issues with regard to that, and the instructor was pretty hard to find. However, we did have all of the emails and the text messages and the students themselves, and Brian's account to Ashley to talk about what was going on as well. So it would have been interesting to get that perspective, and it's definitely a missing piece. However, it would have probably turned into a pretty horrendous blame fest, knowing how the dive community operates, because people would say, well, what's the rebreather unit? And I'd go, it's irrelevant for the learning. Who's the instructor? Irrelevant for the learning. What's the agency? Irrelevant for the learning that's going on. This stuff happens all the time in the diving industry, and it's this need to be reflective of what's happening. Odsil, the biggest takeaway for me is to pace myself on the journey. On the documentary, Brian had placed himself under a lot of pressure to get the course done. I'm walking towards being an instructor, but it's not a process to be rushed, and also a continuous overview or reinforcement of skills and training. And that links into a little bit with Jerome's comment about peer pressure, time pressure, money pressure. So they'd started the program a little while ago, and they were getting money from, it's the Veterans Agency, to undertake these diver training programs. And that program needed to be finished by a certain date. Otherwise, there was a risk that they had to give the money back to the VA. And it was not an insignificant sum that they'd already spent, and they weren't sure that they were actually going to be able to get it back out of the dive center. And the fact that the 4 students on the class were all serving members of the armed forces, and they were all dotted around on their deployments. So it was trying to bring people back together, get the class done, because if it didn't happen this weekend, then they're all going to bomb burst, and it was probably going to be another, I don't know, 2 weeks, a month, 6 weeks before they could get everybody back together again. So one of the things that I say, I teach in high-risk industries as well, is look at the context. Look at how did it make sense for those to do what they did. And nearly, when I look in sort of high-risk industries, for every active failure, so in this case, the not turning the oxygen cylinder on or making sure that that was there is normally about 25, 30 latent errors that lead to that point. So the active error of rushing and not turning the oxygen on and getting off the back of the boat with a hypoxic loop, there's a whole stream of stuff behind, and that will be the same for every accident and near miss that's out there. And it's about changing attitudes to look, to look deeper. Hein, did the rest of the team complete their training? And if so, after spending time with them, do you think it has a positive effect on them as far as how they plan and execute dives now? So yes, the team, the agency that was involved provided another instructor to carry on the training program and certify the divers to do what they did, to do the class that they were due to finish at that stage. In terms of having a change on their life, massively, big time. And unfortunately, I think people who've had a significant emotional event will recognize that. That's another cognitive bias, the recall effect, that the more significant an emotional event, the easier it is to recall it. Now, I've got a theory, and I don't know how I would prove it. When something happens to me and it hurts emotionally or physically, I will remember it a long time. If it happens to one of my close buddies or my family, I'll remember it for a long time, but not as long as if it happened to me. If it happens to my second degree of network, you know, my second degree of freedom that's out there, I might remember it, but it wouldn't be as strong. If it happens to my sort of fourth or fifth degree of separation, in effect, a stranger, well, that wouldn't happen to me because I wouldn't do that. And that is, you know, we have this thing called differencing by distancing. So the further I am away from somebody and I can say that they're different to me, well, I wouldn't make that mistake. And that's one of the hardest bits about human factors, is to get the point across is we're all broadly wired the same way. The fact that a pilot makes a mistake a certain way is the same reason the surgeon makes that same mistake, is the same reason that a diver makes those same mistakes. And it's about recognizing that inherent fallibility or variability to making mistakes that gets this across there. So, Hein, yes, they have certainly changed. And in fact, one of the guys hasn't dived his rebreather since then because he doesn't trust the situation. When we were out there in November last year, he just dived open circuit and didn't dive his rebreather. Thanks, Paul. It's a huge topic, and you can see that I'm quite enthusiastic about it. So if anybody has any questions or comments, in fact, I'll share the last bits. So share screen and go back to here. Play. So that, I would say, hopefully is one of the key takeaways for you, is recognizing that it's not just the technical skills that we need to take into account. There is a whole bunch of other stuff, and the CRM stuff, the non-technical skills at the bottom, are not really considered. And I would love it if this got adopted by the training agencies. It's not a very good point from a business point of view because I'd be out of a job, but actually my goal is much bigger than that. It's about trying to improve diving safety. And the final comment is, knowledge is not enough, we must apply. And willing is not enough, we must do. So knowing is great, but you've got to do something with that knowledge. And then the next bit is, I know I've got to do something, make it happen. Make that first little step. Whatever it is, start to change behaviors. And there's a whole raft of knowledge that you can get from thehumandiver.com, blogs that are there, the books there, and the classes that I run. And I'm not very good at pitching myself, so there we go. Thank you. And if you've got any questions, fire away. Thanks, Tanya.
Gareth?
Karen, thank you very much. Or in fact, I've got something to say.
Yes.
I did. So actually, the final bit is next week is PJ is going to be presenting a collection of images from a recent trip he did with Jill Heineth to Truck, and he'll be discussing a little bit of history behind some of the wrecks and the events that led up to the USA's attack on the Japanese fleet. And he's also going to give a brief summary about what the Explorers Club is about.
Eric?
I've got a question.
Who's that?
Go on, who's that?
Johan Landman from Victoria. That's my wife, John. So how do you balance the fact that you do recreational diving and people mostly on holiday versus the awareness of the actual risk and the skill required when you actually go diving, and how do you balance it with not upsetting people in terms of enjoying their experience of the actual dive?
A great question, Erna. And it starts, so at the individual level, you can lead, you can be a leader, and you can be vulnerable and be a good leader. If you're going to guide or instruct or just be with friends, you can talk about it and say, look, you know, have you ever forgotten your keys before? Have you ever let the milk run out of date, or you've picked up the wrong meat or whatever? Yeah, okay, well, that's the human error. And that doesn't really matter in the supermarket, but we're going underwater. And I don't know about you, but I ain't got gills. And if we run out of gas, it's really badly placed to be. And so I would like you to help me not run out of gas by helping me do my checks. If you look at the DAN numbers, 41% of the fatalities that were there had out of gas as a trigger. And it's like, great, when you tell people don't run out of gas, yeah, I know, that's not a good thing. So it's about genuinely recognizing the risk. Yes, it's a recreational activity, but it's not a life-supporting recreational activity, not a life-supporting environment. So it is about treading carefully, but it is also the fact that you want to, if you can help them manage their risks, they won't be scared and they won't give up diving. There are a number of people who give up diving because they've had bad experiences and they think, oh, it's dangerous. And it's like, no, it doesn't have to be.
There's just another
So
question coming from Paul.
Yeah.
I think it's
so how does one, from Paul Wilkie, is that the one you were talking about?
Yeah.
So how does one deal with a lower ranking diver challenging a super experienced and qualified instructor when the response is, who's the instructor here? Go and find another instructor. It doesn't help you there and then, but this is why trying to bring this into the agency materials and teach instructors about the leadership. Now, I get that there's a sort of an ego and a cultural side of this, but at the same time, the agencies can certainly do something in terms of re-qualification, recertification, using quality control forms, feedback to help deal with that. And I look at all of the QC forms for GUE and the quality assurance, quality control panel for that. And so I get to see every QC form that comes in. And if there are issues in terms of relationships, then actually I'll go and approach the instructor and say, what's going on in a curious manner and find out, because it might just be a personality clash, or it might be some consistency and say, actually, if we've got a trending issue, then we will go and address it. So we as an agency are proactive in that sense.
So there's a very interesting question from Otsilia over there, OT. Second from the bottom.
Yeah, so would you say the industry plays risks involved in? Yeah, I would say so. And actually, the risk management that I see that's practiced in diving, the diving industry in general, especially from the professional side, is about liability risk management, not about operational risk management. Now, there is a little bit of an overlap there, but the bit about compliance and paperwork, and the assumption is if the paperwork is right, you're safe. Not necessarily, because you might be safe from litigation, and then they go, well, they followed standards and they did everything there. And you go, yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it was a safe dive. And something went wrong. So being aware, more aware of this, although you can't be more aware, you can be more targeted in your awareness. Now, could I get anybody in the industry to say that they are downplaying the risks? Unlikely, for very obvious reasons. How would you apply the COVID-19 protocols to diving? Say someone rents gear and gets sick. So I'd ask the question, do you know what the risk is you're taking when you go diving? Because actually, you can't get this risk to zero. There are ways around it in terms of training, but if you're going to go diving with somebody, you have to accept the risk that you may get something go wrong. There is, and you know, even if their gear is cleaned and disinfected before somebody rents it, so it is pristine, for want of a better term, they're on a dive, they run out of gas, and you end up doing a gas sharing event, what are you going to do then? So you have to be in a situation, I mean, it's a really small risk, but it's still there. And it's the same as DCS risk. It's the same as running out of gas. It's the same as having equipment fail. Safety is not the absence of accidents and incidents, but rather the presence of barriers and defenses. So training, protocols, maintenance, and the capacity of the system to fail safely. You are never going to get the risk to zero. So make sure that you can fail safely in that and accept the residual risk that's present. Hopefully that helps, Carol.
That's a fantastic statement to end on. Gareth, thank you so much for your time. It's been,
thank you, Karen.
Been everything I was hoping it would be. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. And I loved it. So yeah, feel free to get in touch if anybody wants to.
Excellent. So once again, if anybody does have any additional questions, you're welcome to forward them on to me or via Gareth's channels, and I'll make sure that he gets them. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Karen. Take care, everybody. Cheers. Bye.